Well, welcome. Today is Thanksgiving Eve, and so we're going to look at two different things today. We're going to start by singing Now Thank We All Our God, and then we'll look at Psalm 107. And I think you're going to really enjoy the history of Now Thank We All Our God. So in order that you can sing, you might want to put it on mute, and then we'll come back on in a little bit. But I'm going to put up the words here so that you can participate with it. So this is how the hymn goes. Now thank we all our God with hearts and hands and voices, who wondrous things has done, in whom his world rejoices, who from our mother's arms, who from has blessed us on our way with countless gifts of love, and still is ours today. Oh, may this bounteous God through all our life be near us, with ever joyful hearts and blessed peace to cheer us, and keep us in his grace, and guide us when perplexed, and free us from all ills in this world and the next. All praise and thanks to God, the Father now be given, the Son in him who reigns with them in highest heaven, the one eternal God, whom earth and heaven adore, for thus it was, is now, and shall be evermore. Well, thanks for putting up with my singing a little bit, but the words are absolutely beautiful. Now Thank We All Our God. It's by Martin Rinckart. And I think, this is my humble opinion, but I think he was one of the most thankful guys that you could ever know. In fact, I think he's much more thankful than I am. And maybe you'd disagree with me, but probably more thankful than you, because he really got it. You see, he grew up over in Eichenberg, Germany, and he was born in 1586, and his dad was a very poor copper miner and didn't make much money. They didn't have many possessions. The only thing that was really interesting about his life is that he sang in the choir in the St. Thomas Church. They're the same church where later the J.S. Bach would be the music director. But after that, he went through some pretty tough times in his life. He, again, didn't have many possessions, but he would later go on and become a pastor. And a lot of politics happened, and he couldn't go the place where he wanted to go. But later on, he was called to be a pastor in that Eilenberg. And it was the year before the 30 Years' War started. And we'll come back to this, but you remember the story of Ruth and Mordecai, how Ruth ends up, or not Ruth, but Esther. Esther becomes the queen of Persia, and you'll remember that she went through the beauty contest and all of that. But I want to come back to that thought because it's very similar to Pastor Martin Rinckart's story, because he becomes a pastor. The 30 Years' War begins, and it is just plain rough. This Eilenberg is the only walled city in the area, and so a lot of the refugees end up fleeing there, both political and military refugees. And in fact, as it goes on, it's so bad that he ends up doing between 40 and 50 funerals every single day. I just can't imagine it. In the year 16, I believe 47, 8,000 people died in 1 year, including Martin's wife. And basically all the other pastors in the city died. And so he was doing everything everywhere in the city. And it's not a small city per se. On top of that, this particular city kept getting taken over by different armies. It would be the Sweden, they took it over at least twice, and then Austria took it over. And in particular, I found this story kind of interesting, that when the Sweden took it over one time, they would demand what we might call a tribute be paid to the king. Well, they couldn't afford it. They had nothing there. And so Martin Rinckart, Pastor Rinckart, he basically said to the people, you need to pray and I'll go and talk to the leaders. And so he went and he talked to them, and of course, what did they do? They didn't listen. And so he basically, in front of the officials, fell down before God and said, God, I plead mercy not with men because they won't listen, but I plead mercy with you. And apparently the representatives from Sweden was so moved by this that they lowered the amount of tribute to just a penance, and they were saved from it. So you've got all this going on. He's got no possessions, and then on top of that, I forgot to mention that he took in all these refugees into his own home with his family. And that was the same year that his wife died, and is caring for all these people. So basically they have nothing to eat, and they're helping other people that have less than them, so that they can even eat a little bit. Now, the hymn, Now Thank We All Our God, I find this fascinating. He wrote it 1 year before the 30 Years War ended. He basically said thank you to God for bringing him through all these troubles and hardships, and they're looking through. But to me, when I hear this hymn and you read it and sing it, it doesn't mention possessions. It doesn't mention money. It doesn't mention all the things, the mammon that we have in this life. I don't know if you notice that in the lyrics, but it's just not there. And let me see if I can put this over to so you can see this. But I find it really interesting that verse 1 doesn't mention this at all. Let me see if I can get it to back up. Sometimes the computer isn't very nice and it won't let you do what you want to do. So let me see if I can get over there again. Here we go. I'll show you the PowerPoint again. Now thank we all our God with hearts and hands and voices. So he's basically getting at the main purpose that we have in life. It's not for possessions and income and stuff. In fact, a lot of people define their life not on the basis of God and loving neighbor, but they define their life on possessions. So you've probably seen a cat lady before, or you see somebody that has John Deere tractors, and you say, yeah, they're a deer person, or they're a race car person, or they're a great cook. And none of that's bad per se. We can be thankful for all these positions, or our home, or all that we have. But instead, Martin Rinckart points out he's thankful for heart, hand, and voices. In other words, so that he can love God and love neighbor. That's what God put us here for, to do those two different things. And that's where our greatest joy will be in this life. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, And I'm going to preach on this. So if you go online this evening at 7 o'clock, I'm going to preach all about the parable of the rich fool. And it goes like this: Man, who appointed me to be judge and arbiter between you? Then he said to him, Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. I mean, possessions are a gift of God, but not the abundance of it. So he tells him this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, You have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take it easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will set you or get you have prepared for yourself? Who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God. In other words, the one who doesn't do what God put him here on the planet for. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to be called a fool by God. I mean, this guy, it's all about himself. I, my. Instead of doing the obvious things, God gives him these extra crops. Instead of giving them out and using them for God's glory, he stores up things he doesn't even need, which is easy for us to do. And I think that's where Martin Rinckart, Now Thank We All Our God, gets it right. It's not about that. It's always about serving God and neighbor. And not that he didn't have joys in life, because Martin Rinckart, I don't know if you know this, but he wrote 7 passion plays, all while the 30 Years War is going on, and 66 hymns, and beautiful hymns at that. So with that said, let's shift over and let's do a little Bible study today. Not that we haven't read some Bible, but this hymn is based on Psalm 107. So if any of you want to read, you can put your back on. You don't have to be muted, Jason, any longer, but if either you or Howard wants to read, you can. Otherwise, I'll start out here. It says, Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. So let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Those he redeemed from the hand of the foe, those he gathered from the lands, from east and west, from north and south. Notice that the psalm isn't centered on possessions and food and clothing, which none of those are bad things. We can be thankful for all of that on Thanksgiving. But the chief thing that he gives thanks for is the story of how God saved them, how he took them out of all the lands, east, west, north, and south. So it goes on. Some wandered in the desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. They were hungry and thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. So obviously God cares about food and drink. I mean, he's going to save them from this wasteland and give them food and clothing. But the bigger picture is that God is at work saving his people. That's where the thanks focuses here. So they cry to the Lord, and of course, what does he do? He answers. He delivered them from their distress. He led them by the straight way to a city where they could settle. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love, his wonderful deeds for mankind, for he satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things. So if you think of like Mordecai and Esther, going back to that story I was telling you earlier, think about how God put Esther there just at the right time. By this crazy beauty contest. I mean, it shouldn't have happened. It didn't make any sense. The king does this stupid thing, throws out his first wife for something that was wrong on his part in a lot of ways, but God uses it. And then the beauty contest, Esther, who's a Jew, becomes queen. And of course, then evil Haman, remember him? He has this plot to destroy the whole people of all the Jewish people, and he's going to put them all to death and have them killed. But it just so happens Esther's the queen. And so Mordecai tells his niece, you were put here for such a time as this. God's going to use you. He doesn't use the word God in the book. That's kind of an interesting thing, but we know it's God at work for such a time. And so she goes to the king, and ultimately, you remember how it goes. He listens, and ultimately Haman is destroyed. And of course, Mordecai ends up in that prestigious position instead, but they're all saved. And I want you to think about that in your own life. God is at work. He's saving us, and he provides what we need. But he puts us here to love him and love our neighbor, and often God works through us. There's this kind of interesting phrase that's used. God uses masks. I don't know. Have you ever heard that before? Jason, Howard, Barbie, masks. In other words, if at Halloween time, you'll see people going around dressed up like, it could be a farmer or a person with an ambulance or a doctor. And so, for example, let's say you're sick, you go to the doctor, and the doctor gives you a medicine, and that helps you get better. Well, the doctor there, they're a doctor, but also God's working through that person. Even though they're wearing the mask of a doctor, God's working there. He's behind what's going on.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean by masks. Or a farmer. The farmer does the harvesting and planting and hauling off to the market, wherever it might be. But that's really God working through that person to bring that food so that people can eat it. So it's the same way with you and I. Yeah, we're our own person. I'm not discounting that, but he works through us. And so if that story I read from Luke 12, where the guy just says, well, it's all mine anyway, and he's storing it up, he's failing to allow God to use him as a mask so that he can provide for those around us. There's a pastor I know. He's actually down at the seminary. His name is Pastor Jeff Gibbs. Interesting fellow, but I watched a video he did not too long ago, and actually it was an audio recording. I got to remember what I'm listening to. And he basically said, what we do with our possessions is we throw them up in the attic because we think we're going to use them at a later time, but God is actually calling us to actually use them. And then he said something about loving Jesus, and I thought this was an interesting quote, that you love Jesus most when you use your gifts, and that's neat, and he works through that. But God is the bigger picture and we thank him for being about saving us from whether it be food or clothing, or in this case from sin and death. Okay, let's keep going. Howard, you up for reading today?
Yep.
Why don't you go 10 through 16.
Okay. Some sat in darkness, in utter darkness, prisoners suffering in iron chains, because they rebelled against God's command and despised the plans of the Most High. So he subjects them to bitter labor. They stumbled, and there was no one to help. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness, the utter darkness, and broke away their chains. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds of for mankind. For he breaks down gates of bronze and cuts through bars of iron.
Okay. Oh, this verse, in a lot of ways, none of us like it. We go through these dark times. I mean, right now with the coronavirus, with having so many funerals right now, kind of like back, we could say the same thing with Martin Rinckart in the 1500s, the 30 Years' War. It had to have been horrible. I think it had to have been worse than even now. And you think, why would God put us through this just horribleness? And then you look at it, here it says it's because they rebelled against God's commands. Now, we don't always know the reason we're going to go through a trouble. I can't tell you this is the reason or that, but we know that what God is doing, it's always for the good. He wants what's better. And for these people, notice what they do. They're going through this darkness, and so they cry to God. And what does he do? He answers it. He brings them out. And so there's a good thing that happens even in the midst of the evil here, the darkness. It's so that they would grow closer to him, so that he can deliver them out of the slavery.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good reminder that even the evil, the bad, and that's what I love the story of Now Think We All Are God, because here's a guy who didn't really have anything other than being able to serve God and his neighbor, and yet he could remain thankful through it all, that he was working. Because you think about it, I bet you Martin Rinckart wouldn't have seen so many people if it hadn't been all that evil that was going on. Probably a lot of people saved because of it. Verse 17, some became fools through their rebellious ways and suffered affliction because of their iniquities. They loathed all food and drew near the gates of death. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. So same thing that we saw earlier. Some are just plain fools. But here he brings them closer to them. He sent out his word and healed them. Notice it's interesting here. He sends his word. He sends a prophet. He doesn't send a doctor here. He sends a prophet, and then he heals them. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them sacrifice thank offerings and tell of his works with songs of joy. I was thinking about that. We've had with this pandemic so far, it's forced us to do a lot of praying for people, and probably like we haven't done. I know some of you've gone through some pretty tough stuff with family members, and it's just horrible. And you say, God, why can't it just be good all the time? And but I tell you, we've had a lot of contact with people that I bet you I never would have ever seen in my office it hadn't been for all of this. And so he's working in the midst of just this crazy stuff. Okay, and then the ending of the psalm here. Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. And by the way, the sea usually symbolizes bad, evil, destruction, because everybody that gets in a boat, what happens? Shipwreck. They don't ever come back. So very scary thing. says, they saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up the tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In the peril, their courage melted away. Notice the sea's very, very dangerous, and so they're thinking they're going to die. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Notice again, this is the third time in the psalm. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. So even God saved the people in the sea. And I know we've prayed several times, Lord, bring an end to this pandemic. And I believe he will answer. He may use a mask. He may use the mask of a vaccine or a doctor. He may use medicine, but to be honest, over and over again, kind of like Sherry last week, a miracle that she come back among us. And it's ultimately God bringing us through these distress. So they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them exalt him in the assembly of the people and praise him in the council of the elders. Yeah. So, Howard, you up for reading?
Yep.
One
Yep.
more, how about 33 to 38 there?
Okay. He turned rivers into a desert, flowing springs into thirsty ground, and fruitful land into a salt waste, because of the wickedness of those who lived there. He turned the desert into pools of water, and the parched ground into flowing springs. Then there he brought the hungry to live, and they founded a city where they could settle. They sowed fields and planted vineyards that yielded a fruitful harvest. He blessed them, and their numbers greatly increased, and he did not let their herds diminish. Then their numbers decreased, and they were humbled.
Okay, so now he's changing even the desert into a place that grows crops. And this is kind of a dual metaphor, because all of us are dry, like dry bones. Ezekiel says that. But God can bring new life into even the dead. Jesus does this too. You can see he brings springs of living water, or as we looked at the storm in the sea, remember the disciples are in the boat and he calms the storm. And then the section before this, it says they loathe food. They're at death. And how many people did Jesus bring back to life and raise from the dead? So fools are saved. And those in darkness, remember that's the message of the Gospel of John. Those in darkness, he called them out of the darkness into light. So this entire psalm is fulfilled in Jesus as he brings them out. Okay. Then verse 39, then their numbers decreased, and they were humbled by oppression, calamity, and sorrow. He who pours contempt on nobles made them wander in trackless waste. But he lifted the needy out of their affliction and increased their families like flocks. The upright see and rejoice, but all the wicked shut their mouths. Let the one who is wise heed these things and ponder the loving deeds of the Lord. So I wanted to share this psalm with you today because that's what the holiday of Thanksgiving is ultimately about. Yeah, it's nice to have stuff. Food and clothing, house and home, land, animals, all that we have. But even more important is the purpose God gave us for life, to love him and love our neighbor. And that's what this psalm's about. Why give thanks to the Lord? Because they cried to him in distress, and he brings us out of it. So I hope this Thanksgiving you think about that, how God delivers us from all these things. And he does provide all the other things that we need for life as well. So we don't want to forget that. But why does he give us all that stuff in this life? So that we'll love him and love our neighbor and serve him in those ways. So we'll stop right there. I'd like to close with a short prayer, and then we'll close out. Lord God, thank you for today as we celebrate Thanksgiving today, and tomorrow as the whole country pauses for a little bit. I pray that people would see what you have given, and most importantly, they would see that you value them and have called them to love you and to serve neighbor. Ask for your blessing on this whole day. Forgive us when we've valued possessions and income more than the purpose you've called us to in this life. I ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.